Well, I'm Rich Hannibal, and Julia asked me if I'd be willing to MC tonight. So this would be a good opportunity for us to share some fond memories with Brian, say some words. I've had the privilege to know Brian in a lot of different contexts. So as we look back, you think about some of the memories. So being at family camp together, I have fond memories of playing King of the Kayak with Brian. When we used to have these kayaks that you'd sit on the top of, they weren't cut out, and we'd get 10 guys out in the middle of the pond, and the objective was to be the last one standing on your kayak, and so you'd have to tip everybody else off into the water. And it was a game we all enjoyed, Brian loved. Brian has been such a good friend, and when I think back to we have a men's group, and we meet every Wednesday morning for breakfast for the last 8 years or so. And as we talk about various issues, whether it be issues with our boss at the office or things with our kids, what was going on, and you would turn to people and you'd raise questions, and a bunch of people would talk, and Brian would just listen, and then finally at the end, Brian would interject. And Brian always had the most wisdom. You'd always pause and say, wow, that is true. That is really a smart thing. He was just a really wise person, and I always really appreciated that about him. As we look back, a lot of fun times. I remember many years ago when the Wilsons invited us to come to a dance party at their house, and they cleared out all the furniture in their living room, and we had about 30 people dancing in their living room. Just a great idea, but such a sweet guy. So I'm going to open it up. Who would like to come up and share a few remembrances? Danny Ketcher, you're the first man. Here you go.
Just to clarify, Brian never had any problems with his kids. He just had, wise thoughts for us who were struggling. So Brian and I were both only children. And I would say additionally, not a very large extended family. So Brian, I know Julia often described him as a men's group fellowship junkie. Because he loved, he loved having close friends. He valued friendship. He invested his life in friendship. And like me, I think a little bit because of being an only child, not having a large extended family. And, I loved that about him, and I felt it. He reached out to me at times, and we saw movies together, and we met at Wakefield Park and went for walks. And the fact that he valued friendship, I don't know. It meant so much to me.
Thank you. Who'd be next? Come on.
I'm Paul Gilmer. I worked with Brian about 10 years ago. We were in the same office working on some interesting work with South Central Asia. And I would walk by his office a lot. And there were only a few of us that had these windowed offices. And then we'd go to the big boss, who had the only private office there. And so I would often walk by because he was more important because he was closer to the big boss. But I would always say hi or stop in, and even if he was very busy, which I know he was, he always had time to just chat a little bit, listen, share updates and things, and so very great guy to know. I talked to Julia, and I remember seeing her at in Istanbul. He came to a conference there, and he brought her along, and I think left Grace and Peter alone, somewhere, and she came over. And so we had a great time in Istanbul together, getting to know them. But I wanted to leave the thoughts for the kids that, people have said a lot about your dad being very humble and kind and listening, and I think that's all true. So I just want to say that hopefully you'll get some more stories here, some more remembrances of him. I only know him the last 10 years, but we joined the Foreign Service about the same time. I'm about the same age. I'm from Washington, from the West Coast. Looking at the yearbooks, I say, that's my yearbook. We all had that hair. Brian kept it. I didn't so much. But anyway, just wishing for Grace and Peter fond memories until you meet again there in the future home. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for your service. You just give your name when you...
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Charles. This is Paolo. We joined the Foreign Service together with Brian in 1985. And on behalf of Brian's classmates, for training as diplomats who had the great honor of representing our country, the United States of America, overseas, we remember Brian's quiet kindness. We have the feeling that we were joined together in that experience as we set out to travel the world, where some of us remain overseas and some of us who have retired are scattered throughout the United States. I think some of our colleagues are watching remotely. Hi, if you're there. And on behalf of all of us from all that time ago, our condolences to Brian's family and so many of his friends who are here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your service. Who will be next? Julia.
I meant to get out here quicker. Thank you again for coming. Thank you for joining us. And please keep going back for seconds. We have lots of good food in there. Thank you for staying. I just wanted to share a little bit about why we're having this meal and why this meal. So if you're here, you know that Brian had a long journey with cancer. You may or may not know that he also had a longer journey with major depression, that he struggled with depression through most of his adult years, especially his 30s and 40s. And there were some really dark times when he really didn't know how he would keep going. But he never lost his love of life and living. And I called him the depressed optimist. He was always sure there would be better days. And with his cancer, he was always sure he had another card up his sleeve to beat cancer. And, he did it for a long time, so he didn't think he would ever lose any more of those cards up his sleeve. I think especially in his journey of learning to live with depression and not let it define him, he developed practices, disciplines, and habits to cultivate a life of gratitude, and also just to have really disciplined thinking. And I am the complete opposite, so I was always feeling like, oh, how do you do this? But he knew that part of healthy thinking and emotions was just savoring every minute and being grateful for every minute. And someone gave me the word savor the other day. He really did savor life and every little thing. And he didn't live a fancy life. He wasn't a big foodie. He didn't go on, he wasn't into extreme sports or huge fancy trips and exotic lifestyle. He did things pretty simple, but he savored them all. And I just wanted to share some examples. We've mentioned he liked to read. He was an English and education major before he was in the Foreign Service. He taught middle school. Which I think prepared him for the Foreign Service. He would read he would read several books at once. He had a stack next to his bed, and he would just pick a few each night and read methodically through them. And someone was just sharing with me how he would share with them what he was reading, because part of savoring is sharing your experience with someone else. And he loved to do that. So books were one way he did that. He had, I inherited an antique set of books called Every Man's Library from my grandmother. So they were very old, and they were full of biographies and histories and little snippets of novels and poetry. And he just thought it was really fun to read through these. And he got to volume 12. And then he wanted to tell me all these crazy old little nuggets he'd find in these old books. He read through the Pulitzer Prize fiction list. He, watched the AFI's 100 top movies. He just sort of made lists and then worked through them to enjoy them and savor them and interact with family and other people about how he enjoyed them. So that was a way that he made sure he savored. Where? Okay. Okay. Oh, didn't even notice that. So I admire him. I admired him for that, and I will always. I was the kind of the opposite extreme of what he was doing with his life, and I look at it now and just realize what a gift he gave me and our family. Other things that he did very methodically. He was a high pointer, which means he tried to get to the high point of every state. And he didn't do a couple of the technical climbs, but other than that, he got there and found parts of the country that normally people don't go to. And I went to many of those with him. And sometimes the kids were babies on his back doing some of those. He was always thumbing through atlases, planning trips, and things he even knew he'd never do, but he just loved looking at maps, as you may have heard. He loved nature so much, and he just loved to get out and immerse himself. And when he kind of realized he couldn't do that anymore, it really grieved him. When he was in all these hospitalizations this last year, he discovered the CARES videos. Maybe if you've been in a waiting room or at a hospital, they have these wonderful videos of nature and music. And he actually subscribed to it at home. And when he just couldn't sleep at night, because of the pain, or he was just having a hard time concentrating, he would just watch these beautiful videos, and he would weep watching them because he just wanted to be there, and he just thought they were so beautiful. So again, he just made sure that he filled his life with the things that he loved and he savored. He also enjoyed food. Now again, he was no fancy foodie, but the things he liked a lot. He liked bananas, and I had to curate our bananas and make sure that they were always unripe, ripe, and just past ripe, because he liked them a little bit brown, and just keep that forever cycling through the house. Now I don't know what to do with all of the bananas I keep buying, but he loved potatoes, and he loved Cheerios. He loved comfort food like turkey and mashed potatoes. And when he couldn't really eat anymore, he got really excited about ginger ale. So you guys were having ginger ale, because that's the best beverage in the world, only Canada Dry. And when he couldn't eat anything, he loved to chew ice. And we got the special ice nugget machine because that was the best ice. And so he savored ice and would get happy about it. So, to the end, he was just savoring what he could savor in life. So the things we're having today, he loved to go to Potbelly from work. He loved watermelon. He loved ice cream. We're going to have ice cream sandwiches at some point, I think. I just thought it would be fun to enjoy some of the things that he savored, and just share that that's probably the most, well, obviously, he had an impact on my life. But in thinking about him in these last few weeks, that to me is an embodiment of what he gave to me, was the ability to savor like that. So I wanted to share that. And please, if anyone else would like to come up, we're really enjoying hearing from you.
Please come up. A friend of mine, Steve, spent a few minutes with him in the last week when he wasn't able to eat much of anything, and things were really hard at that point, and he was savoring that last bit. And I remember Steve said, I gave Brian some berries, and he was just so overjoyed. And he said, I think the last words Brian said to me was, "Damn good berries, boy, damn good berries." Here, come right here.
Hi, my name is Renee Faulkner, and my family and I moved in next door to the Wilson family about 6 years ago. So if you were looking at their house, we were on the right. On the left were all the Jeeps, if you've ever been there. So we were on the right, and I actually didn't intend to get up to speak. I didn't know Brian that well, just mostly as a neighbor, some chit-chat, waving, a few block parties and an ice cream social that they hosted one time shortly after we moved in, so they could get to know a few of the new neighbors in the family. But as Julia was talking about savoring, I actually thought, as I was driving here, I had kind of two recollections of Brian that they didn't seem worthy of sharing at first, but now I think maybe they are, so I'll share them. One was maybe a couple of years ago. I got a phone call from Julia, and I was down in the Richmond area with a couple of my kids for a basketball tournament, and she said, "I think your dog is in distress. She's in the backyard, and she's been barking nonstop, and that's really unusual. Is everything okay?" And I said, "No. The child who was supposed to bring her in before he left the house apparently forgot, so she's stuck in the backyard. Do you think that Brian would, or somebody could possibly run over there and I can manually unlock my door, my front door, through an app? Could somebody go in and let the dog in?" And she said, "I'm sure Brian would love to do that." So I unlocked the door, and we actually have a video camera inside our house that was to keep an eye on our kids when my husband and I were working, and if they were home after school, we had a few strategically placed cameras, and we could speak through them and say, "Don't do that," or "Hi." And so I actually had a quick peek just to make sure it happened, that somebody came over and that the dog was okay. And it was actually a very sweet exchange watching Brian go into our house and rescue our dog, and he actually spent several minutes with her. He kind of sat down on the floor and he rubbed her belly and he played with her and he talked to her and he hummed a little song. It was just the sweetest little interaction, and so it was kind of a savoring the moment example that I just wanted to share. And then he made sure she was safe, and he left, and they texted me to say she's fine. So that was, we appreciated them. We appreciate them as great neighbors, and that's a memory that I will have. And then the second one was shortly after we moved in, I happened to glance out the window and I saw Brian sitting in the grass, and it was sort of like an awkward thing because you don't often see someone just sort of sitting with their legs out and just sort of sitting there. It looked like maybe he'd plopped down or fallen, and we kept looking, and my husband and I said, "What do you think he's doing? He's just sitting there. Do you think he's okay? Does he need help?" And so eventually I said, "I'm going to go walk by and just make sure he's okay." And I walked by and I said, "Hi, what are you doing?" And he said, "I'm just pulling some weeds." And I've never seen anybody that just he was just sitting and he was taking his time and he was just kind of slowly tending to the lawn. And then he would sort of slowly shift into a new spot. And I mean, my dad is a weed picker. Like, he can't walk by a weed without grabbing it, but he just gets down, he snatches it up, and he moves on. And just to watch Brian so intentionally kind of savoring the moment and sort of communing with nature. Now that I put it in perspective for all the things that I've heard about him, I can just kind of feel the vibe that he had, and he was such a mellow guy, and I just appreciate the fact that he was taking the time to be intentional with that activity and to commune with nature and with the lawn. And so that's another simple memory I wanted to share. So.
Hey, so I'm Corky Eddins, assistant pastor at Christ Church Vienna, but I received 3 letters. I'll read one now, and then the next person can get up here ready. This is a short one. This is from a colleague of his who's now in Moscow. Okay, Jeff Martineau, I think I'm saying the name right, maybe. Dear Brian, in my first tour in Guatemala, I was a young officer encountering unexpected difficulties and challenges. You were already at post as a more experienced officer who understood the Foreign Service and Guatemala. You were also a Christian, which ended up making a huge difference to me during my time there. You were a friend who listened to me, gave me advice, and showed me how to be a Foreign Service officer who lives as a Christian but doesn't sacrifice his principles. In the years that came and after you got sick, you were still a friend to me. I can't count the number of times we met for lunch, or you picked me up early in the morning to go to a men's fellowship time. It was painful watching you suffer and struggle with that awful disease, but you handled it with patience and grace. Even as you were treated for cancer, you rose to become an influential figure in the management of the State Department. The last time I saw you in person was here in Moscow, where we grabbed a few moments together amidst your busy schedule. I will miss you, both for yourself and what you showed me about God. You reached the goal before the rest of us. You now see clearly and know fully, even as you are fully known. Thank you for your friendship. Until we meet again, Jeff.
Hi, I'm Dana Wichterman, and I've prepared some remarks because I'm not good at speaking off the stump. But Brian and I knew each other for over 30 years. We first met at Washington Community Fellowship, both of us single and ready to launch our professional careers in government. As we met our spouses, the four of us continued those friendships. And in fact, I felt an instant connection with Julia. Given our mutual love of literature, story, our love of other cultures and countries. Through the various passages of our life, we were always a few steps behind the Wilsons in terms of church community. Each new stage of life, when we felt a need to move on to a new local community, there was Brian and Julia sitting there before us. So at the end of in the last couple of years, we've said jokingly, if you're planning to move on, just tell us and save us some time so we know where we're going next. I think we went through four rounds together. For many years, we were in the same home group and from Falls Church, and there was just such an intimacy and transparency that was practiced in that. I know many of you are here, and that's just beautiful to see. It really experienced with the Wilsons and others that beauty that you have in the family of God, and our children played together, and I just have such fond memories of Grace, you and Jenna and Peter, all you guys playing with our kids. It's been an honor to call the Wilson family lifelong friends and have shared so many different stages of life. And two really great memories. Washington Community Fellowship used to do, I don't know if they still do, but they used to do awesome dances. And we held one at the Wilsons that was just fantastic. Brought down the house and had a great time. And then another, and you may not know this, but you guys are, well, you know you're hospitable, but Bill and I spent my favorite Valentine's at your home. And you made that evening about games, but about meaning. And we had questions related to love and marriage and remembering. And your mom and dad were just really good, Peter and Grace, about drawing out depth and beauty in a fun way. So I just want to say those are special memories. Thank you.
You can come stand next and be ready.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Here.
Okay.
That's all.
All right.
Why don't you face that way, if you will? And
Okay.
sir, you- yeah.
Not a public speaker. Okay, here we go. Close to this? Okay. I am Brian's cousin. There's not many of us. There's also my brother. But get this. My dad was Brian's, no, Okay, let's go again. My okay, Brian's dad was my dad's uncle. Brian was a complete generation ahead of me. I always totally looked up to him, and of course we all did. He was a little tall. But anyway, while we were younger, because I'm older, you know, he was just a cute little kid, and he was cute. But I was only 8. So, like, looking down, ooh, wow, you know, it was fun. And then when that one was a baby, they came up to our lake place. And our lake place is in the state of Washington. And he brought him, and he was really little, and he rolls over. But we're kind of a loud family. And he rolls over, and we all just cheer. We think this is terrific. You know, hey, this baby comes and visits, and he rolls over, big trick. And he wouldn't roll over again, is what I heard, for a few months. We overwhelmed Peter. And then another time, they came to visit us at our house. Such a treat. I don't know if that was the time in the motorhome. I can't remember. But anyway, there was baby Grace this time. Oh, so cute. And then there was Peter, still really, really cute, but really active. And Brian went outside with him. And we have a big, beautiful pond in our yard. And this big, beautiful pond must have been interesting to, again, Peter. I'm picking on him. And Peter falls in the pond. Well, this pond is really, really slick. He has no life jacket on or anything. So, of course, Brian, being the wonderful father that he is, thought he should save him. So he went in this pond. Well, we're looking at the cute Grace, and we don't hear him yelling. All of a sudden, here are these 2 very, very, very wet rats kind of at our door. Brian looking so very, very apologetic to like Julia, like, oh my gosh, I did this. You know, I let my son, you know, fall in the water. But anyway, it was obviously everything was a good ending and everything went well, but I'll kind of always remember that. The other thing, and I'm talking too long, is that we had a common love of Mason Lake. And we now own that property and have unfortunately took down the beautiful cabin that was there because we wanted to live full time. It was 750 square feet and no insulation and no heat. So anyway, we got that, and but it was the love of Brian and the lake that I think originally got us all together. And the lake faces the Olympics. And I was able to show it to him because she's so gracious through FaceTime again before he passed. Anyway, I'm done. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Basil Iliopoulos. I had the pleasure of knowing Brian for, 7 or 8 years. He used to belong with us in a Thursday night Christian men's fellowship group. And the memory that I have of Brian was I think it was fall of 2019, when his cancer had advanced and he could no longer drive. One night I came to his house and I drove him in his Mustang. He had a convertible, very powerful Mustang car, and we had the top down, and so I drove him to our men's meeting, and then after the meeting I drove him back home once again with the top down, and I think he was very thrilled. I could tell that he was very happy and very thrilled to feel the wind going through his hair, and a couple of times I stepped on the accelerator and I drove a bit fast, and he was quite thrilled about that. So that's my memory of Brian. Thank you.
Yeah, he did love that car, didn't he?
My name's Gail Wenger. Brian was one of the few people who knew me when I was Gail Lilly.
We lived together at a house across the street from Washington Community Fellowship in 1985. It was a long time ago. and I'm sad to say, I don't even really remember what brought Brian there, how he came to live at the house. It was the second year of Tabitha House. But that was our relationship. We shared a house for, I don't know, it was just a couple months, I think, before we were on to other things. And I remember, I think it was the early, well, when were the kids little? The last I had seen them, they were at our house, but Grace and Peter had to just be, they were little. We have pictures of them either playing on our drums or on our piano. I don't remember. But that's really the last time we'd seen them. I ran into Julia somewhere at some point in the time since then. I knew that I could always get in touch with Julia through Jeannie Herbert because I knew that they knew each other. And I appreciated that I could get in touch with Julia. In fact, when I did run into Julia, it was at Jeannie Herbert's house in November twice. And I was thrilled to see Julia because it had been so long. I was just thrilled when we happened to be at Jeannie's Amani bead party at the same time. Brian was not there, and I think the second time, a year or two ago, you tried to get him on the phone or something. I don't remember if we were able to do that. He was traveling at the time. But I was thrilled to see Julia. But I hadn't seen Brian for years. And I just want to share this little story. I feel like God works with me in little ways, but to me are quite remarkable. And in this case, it happened to be that a good friend of ours, Lisa, I call her Lisa P., who lives in New York, and she was planning, okay, what month? It was April, right? In April, things were starting to open up, and we had been vaccinated, and we could get together. And so she was getting some friends to get together in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania. And she was apologizing to me for including a few more people that we didn't know. I was fine with that. I didn't see anything wrong with it. But she was explaining to me there was another couple, Danny and Christine Ketcher, who we know and have known for years. My husband, Phil, we've known Danny. Did we know you before you were married? I don't know. I think so. So we just have all these connections from years ago, from being in Washington, D.C., from the early 80s. We knew the Wichtermans. Just so many relationships that we have that we don't see people. We've grown out of touch in a way, but it's so delightful when we do see them. Anyway, so Lisa P. was planning this trip, and she's explaining to me, I'm sorry, I'm inviting some more people. I hope you don't feel uncomfortable about this. There's a couple that somebody said, well, why didn't you invite them? And I thought, well, yeah, I really should. I don't know that they'll be able to make it. And she just happened to throw out their name. She said, Brian and Julia Wilson. I said, what? Brian and Julia Wilson, are you kidding me? Lisa had no idea that we knew them. I had no idea that Lisa knew them. And just to say, so Lisa and I lived together. It was after I lived with Brian, before Phil and I got married. So I was just over the moon thrilled with this. And it was a little iffy that they would be able to come. And I had just not really been aware of Brian's cancer journey. And so I was so thankful that Brian and Julia were able to come up to Mercersburg, and I got to see him. I mean, it really has been since the 90s when I'd seen him the one time since we lived. So it was just, to me, just so remarkable in how God used Lisa to arrange that when she had no idea that we knew each other. And it was just, you know, my days of living with Brian, it was just such a sweet friendship that I will just treasure always. And I just thank the Lord that we were able to have that time up in Mercersburg to just be So I'm thankful for that, and trying to think if there was another part of that story. But I guess I'll close with that. Yeah.
Thank you. Sure.
All right, so I have two things. First off, I know Brian will want to give a shout out to all his State Department employees that are here. I can tell you, he went to work every day feeling blessed that he had a job that made a difference in the world, that what he did was important, and he loved every single person. Yeah, there might have been one or two that he worked with. Oh, someone's pointing to themselves over there. I can see that. So seriously, he loved going to work, and he told us that all the time. The other thing, I need to correct Julia. She said that Brian was not into extreme sports. In 2011, 2012, Brian was like, yeah, someday I'd like to ride the C&O Canal Path. And 2013, over the July 4th weekend, if you can imagine what the temperatures are like on the July 4th weekend, and it was a heat wave. Brian rode the 185 miles from Cumberland, Maryland to Georgetown, carrying his camping gear and camping at night in a 4-day stretch. So I don't know how many of you have actually cycled that before, but that's a tough ride. But when you consider he had just been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, I'll call that extreme. So Brian was an extreme sports guy.
Here, you're next.
My name is Phil Barth, and I'm an old friend of Brian's, and I'm not referring to my age and my hair, but color, but what I mean is that being in the Foreign Service, our paths intersected here and there and in and out, so I was really close with Brian back probably 15 years ago when we played softball together, we carpooled together, and got together for breakfast. I think it was Thursday mornings, I want to say, but I also had the opportunity to see him and to hear about him at work because I'm with the Foreign Service as well. So, but as life in the Foreign Service is, we our lives intersected for a while, and then kind of I didn't see Brian for a long time until about 2 years ago. And I had no idea, when I came back from overseas, my last overseas tour, I had no idea the degree to which Brian's cancer had developed and had progressed. I did not know that he had been diagnosed with stage 4. So I was over in OBO, which probably makes some of you roll your eyes, but somebody said, well, Brian's really struggling with this cancer. I was like, well, in my mind, I didn't say this, but it was like, well, yeah, I know this story. It's, he's been doing this for a long time, and I did not realize how bad it had gotten. So when I actually saw him then, the last time I saw him about 2 years ago, I was out for one of my runs, and I'm somewhat spontaneous when I run. I just sort of, I felt like I should go this way, and as I did, I went down the road past the Little Run Elementary School and it came right out in front of your house, and he was out there working in the garden. And it had been years, I don't know how many years since I'd seen him, but it was just like he was present, there. So I did not know, he seemed a little bit more subdued than I remembered him, but it just seemed like, oh, okay, what's the weekend, he's allowed to do that. But I knew he was there, he was present with me, and that was the thing that I remembered and liked so much about Brian, was that that you knew he was listening to you, that he was, he wasn't just kind of thinking about what he's going to say next or whatever like that. And I always felt accepted and listened to, even though Brian had a great sense of humor, but I think he was a little put off by my sarcasm sometimes. In fact, he let me know when I went a little too far, but I didn't feel any judgment. It was just like, Phil, that was too far, kind of thing. So, but like I said, it was impressive to me that after so many years that it was just like we were together again. It was just that kind of presence, and I think that's my limited exposure with Brian in his work environment, I didn't deal with him much on a working level, but State Department talks a lot about your corridor reputation, and despite the reputation for the State Department being diplomatic, they're not always very diplomatic when it comes to your corridor reputation. And but in the case of Brian, it was impeccable. I never heard anything negative, and I think there are a lot of egos in the State Department, and Brian was not one of them. He was, if anything, I would say he was a presence, and I think that's what gave him his power and his effectiveness in doing what he did professionally. And I think that same characteristic was what I appreciated so much about him as a friend.
Peggy's going to come up.
Hi, I'm Peggy Adderton, and Brian and Julia have been part of a home group that I'm in for a long time, a while, I guess it went on. And of course, during COVID, you didn't actually see the person in person. You saw their little face on the screen. But two things come to my mind about Brian, and that is his mind. And there's a verse in Romans 8:6, the mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. And I really feel like that second half of that verse really magnifies who Brian is and was on earth. Two cases to prove the point. Camp Hebron was mentioned by Rich already. And so our first night in Camp Hebron, we'd always have a trivia night. And everyone would want to have Brian on their team because he knew everything. And you would always win if Brian was on your team. And that was one thing. And then the other is when he shared in our home groups or any kind of Bible study, he always had a depth of what he was sharing. It wasn't just, fly by night, but it was from deep in who God had made him to be, and he shared that. And I always will appreciate that.
Thank you, Peggy. Anyone else who'd like to share? A second letter?
Yeah. Okay. This is from Justin Steckley, who currently is in West Africa. So he said, I'm sorry I can't be there. Hi, Brian. You embodied compassion, collegiality, selflessness, friendship, and professionalism. I remember in early 2011 when you and I were assigned as mentor-mentee, and we ate chicken wings and drank a couple mugs of beer. You patiently observed the eager entry-level officer describe himself and what he wanted to do in the Foreign Service. Your silence spoke volumes. We've heard that, haven't we, before? And your words spoke libraries. Thank you for your guidance. As I would tumbleweed my way through the Washington, D.C. area every couple of years, you always made time for me and we would break bread over rich conversation. Perhaps the conversations were some of the hundreds you had had in your amazingly successful FS career, but for me, they were enormous beacons of normalcy in this bizarre career. Thank you for taking time to speak with me. When I pulled an unforgivable act and missed lunch at your house with your family and a ranking member of the European Board, I guess, EUR Board? Bureau, sorry. You showed compassion and forgave me. Even though I still feel horrible about that idiotic move, I'm also astounded at your level of compassion and propensity to forgive. Thank you. In my second tour in Libreville, Gabon, you were a much-needed sounding board when I reached out to you to express my frustrations. You patiently listened, that theme again, as I rambled on. I could see your patient face and eyes and knew that because you were in this world and in the department, at least one person understood what I was going through and everything would turn out all right. As with most things in the Foreign Service, things did turn out all right. Thank you for being there for me. Going into my third tour, My bidding strategy blew up and left in tatters. With 1 week before handshakes, parenthesis job offers, would go out, I didn't have much, as much as a look, let alone an air kiss or wink, parenthesis foreign servant jargon. So some of you understand that. Okay, an air kiss or a wink. My career development officer presented a couple options, and one was Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. Norma, my wife, and I never thought we would serve in the Middle East, but after researching the post a bit, we grew to believe it would be a good place for us and our boys. When I called you to discuss the options, you said you knew Deborah Smoker Ali, and as she was the management counselor in Riyadh. How do you say Riyadh? Riyadh. Thank you. Sorry, I haven't been there. My response was naive, like most of my responses when I talk to you, and I said something like, "Oh, that's nice." You let out a little chuckle and a small sigh and said, "This is where you asked me if I would be willing to reach out to her on your behalf." Well, so Brian, isn't it? Well, the rest is history. I had a fantastic 3-year tour there under Deb's wing and was able to parlay that MO gig into my current one. Thank you for being such an amazing mentor. You did so much for me, Brian. I wish I could have done more for you. I would like you to know I enjoyed meeting Julia, Peter, and Grace when you came to eat Mexican food with us in our apartment in Falls Church a couple years ago. You have a wonderful family. I relished our deep conversations over meals in D.C., and while I know you kept most of your health challenges from me, I thank you for letting me in when I gently probed. I understand your health journey the past few months were fraught with challenges. I wish I could have seen you. The next time I was in D.C., hoped we could have had a chance to have another one of our chats I so enjoyed. Since we won't have a chance to catch up, I hope my prayers have reached you and that you know that I will always remember you and try to embody your wise approach to relationships, both personal and professional. Sincerely, Justin Steckley, Foreign Service Officer.
Thank you. Anyone else like to come up and share? My favorite part of that letter is, and I can just see Brian saying, "This is where you ask me if I can help you." That's just Brian, right? I mean, it's a perfect statement of him.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I've worked for Brian 3 times since 2012, and he was a wonderful, wonderful boss and a career leader and a bigwig. And a few friends and I have worked when we were, little peons. And Brian was a mentor to us as mid-level rising foreign service officers from the beginning. I met Brian in a very hairy time for what he did right after the Arab Spring, right after Benghazi, and it was tough. And I was at the end of my rope and doing that work, his work, in his area, and sweating at 9 p.m. at night. And Brian would stroll down occasionally that late with that wonderful hair and looking great in a suit, whatever time it was, and tell me to go the hell home. And it would be okay. And I took that to heart from that job. And I went to the next job, and he was our boss again, and in human resources, which is an interesting area. We had long talks around these tables about the future of the newbies. And Brian is mentoring and giving speeches to these newbies and helping them get excited about a couple hard years they might have. And the junior officers, ELOs, whatnot, had, little hard stories, things they needed help with, little changes. And some of the stories were like, pull out your tiny violin and roll your eyes when you were a flippant younger person like I was. And Brian had compassion through it all. But we didn't know about his journey. We didn't know about the cancer at that time. And Brian could have said so wisely, I know hardship and this isn't it. Let's do this thing. But Brian gave us an example of leadership to care about everybody, even in their smallest moments or their hardest moments, and make a wise and fair decision, which I've taken with me to another place where I worked for him a few levels. He was by this time many levels above me, and it was when I, at a time when his cancer stage 4 had come back, and I'd heard through the grapevine that he wasn't doing that well, and cancer is touched my life deeply, not me, but my life deeply recently. And it really threw me for a loop. And I was hangdog in the cafeteria at our building, not there. And I saw Brian, and I knew he wasn't well either. But he stopped me in this classic crisscross basement corner where all the bigwigs meet their other bigwigs to have coffee. And he stopped me and pulled me aside and looked me in the eyes and was so present and said, "David, I know what's going on. Hang in there. Keep fighting. She'll keep fighting. It'll be okay." And it sticks with me, and I wish I would have told Brian this in the last few months. And Julia, thank you for putting together the Caring Bridge, because I heard so many of these stories about Brian's life outside of work, which in a way we didn't know about. And I'm so happy he had a side life that besides this consuming career we've had. And it's really fulfilling to me to see such a wise, wonderful man create such a wonderful family and have such dear friends and spirituality outside of work. And is an example for us all, for me to this day. So thank you, Brian and Julia.
Thank you so much, and thanks for your service.
Can I talk twice?
There is a limit here. I mean, but for you,
Thank
we'll
you.
make an exception, Dan.
I wanted to add, Brian loved life. And, in the last days, there were a few of us had the privilege to have a front row seat to what was going on with him. There were times when Julia hadn't slept for a while, and she would call and say, "Can somebody come help out?" Alex and Rich and I and numbers of others in these men's group would come. And one of the things we saw, he was, towards those last days, he when he knew he was going to die, he was heartbroken about, that he wouldn't be here to be with all of us. At one memorable time, he wept with Alex uncontrollably on the couch about what he knew was coming. And when I also had a time of taking him for a drive in his midlife crisis car. And he must have said to me 6 times in the car, "I don't want to die." Brian is with Christ, and we miss him. And for those of us, Jeff was there often, that had a front row seat at his final days. It was a privilege and an honor and inspirational that I hope my final days are like that also. That my final days are spent talking about Christ, talking about my family and my dreams, and not, I don't know, feeling sorry for myself. It was an inspiration.
Bill.
Thank you. Yes, I am Bill. And I was trying to think of specific memories, and what I really was feeling was how just seeing all the people here especially from family camp, and thinking about Brian in those years when we were going to family camp and just the wonderful times we had there, thinking of memories of him at church and also at Boy Scouts. Peter and my son Adam are the same age, and we're in Scouts together, and so I just have lots of fond memories of Brian on those camping trips. And one thing that I could always count on was that Brian knew how to do stuff. Just as a Scout dad, I was always impressed that he could, do things on camping trips that I was like, I didn't know how to do that, but Brian did, and so that was really wonderful. I also worked in EUR, but many years before Brian, I guess, because I didn't know him there. But the one memory that I really treasure that comes to mind is my wife and I and family went to Istanbul for a couple of years, exactly 10 years ago, actually. And some of the only people who came to visit us were Brian and Julia. And I think you actually brought me my guitar, if I'm not mistaken, because I didn't bring it when we moved there, and so you brought it So there you go. So I appreciated that. But the thing that I really appreciated was that first year in Turkey was a very difficult year for us as a family. And when Brian and Julia came, it was just like, oh, these wonderful people, this familiar face from back home. It was just so reassuring for them to come and be with us, even just for a few days. And it was just really wonderful to see them then. And I regret, I've said over the last 8 years or so that we've been home, I think I only saw Brian maybe once or twice shortly after we got home. And I would always say to Carrie, we need to have the Wilsons over or something. And it just goes to show how time just slips by. And, suddenly there it is 8 years later, and we didn't do that, and I regret that. But just to be here today with so many fantastic people that we've known through family camp and other places, that was Brian's quality, was to draw people together. And I will say one other thing. Phil Barth spoke a moment ago. He and I and Brian and another gentleman, Tyler Aberley, were in a men's prayer group together for a while. And we would meet at a diner and have breakfast. And I just remember those times, Brian's prayers. Again, people have mentioned how, the depth that he had in his faith, and just the encouragement that he gave to me on so many occasions in those prayer times. So it's not one specific memory, it's just lots of wonderful.
Thank you, and thanks for your singing, and thanks for getting him his guitar. He would not have been able to play if you hadn't brought it to him in Istanbul. He wouldn't have one, so appreciate that. Ray.
Thank you, Rich. My name's Ray Miligrano. Us Miligranos are usually behind the camera, so it's unusual for me to be up here. But I have a lot of memories of Brian, and Peggy said it stole one of mine about the trivia games. Always needed to have Brian and Julia on our team, and Betty, my mother-in-law. But my first recollection of Brian is when, back at Church of the Apostles, we used to play softball on Sunday after church over at Van Dyke Park. And Tony invited the Wilsons to come, I think, after you first came here. And all I could see is his face coming up. Can I get an amen? Amen. But that smile, those eyes, I just knew I wanted him to come back, and I wanted to be his friend, because I felt welcomed instead of me having to welcome him. And the other thing at camp, you guys started coming to camp, and I guess that's when you got the diagnosis, or at one point, and he was down at the lake, kind of being off to himself, because he didn't want to be with people at that point, And I went down to him, and we talked, and I shared with him that at that time, I was a 5-year survivor. And he didn't know that. And I forget what we said, but it was like, really? 5 years? I'm not out of here tomorrow? I can possibly beat this, or I can make it go longer? And I'll never forget that, and that gave us a bond. Even though we didn't see each other often, we were together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Anyone else that would like to share? You have a third letter, I take it.
I do. Mine was the email that was given out. But before I jump into this other one, when our church started 10 years ago, Brian and Julia were part of the founding family, and Peter and Grace. And I just kind of got to know him a little bit, but the last 3 or 4 or 5, maybe 5, 6 years, I don't know. We really spent some meaningful time together. And what I think of two things when I think of Brian. One, he was continually wanting to grow as a person, professionally, spiritually, relationally, and he pursued that. He pursued growth, spiritually as well, and in friendship. He pursued growing friendships, and I was the benefactor of one of those. And The second thought that hit me was I felt safe going below the waterline with Brian. He was just that kind of a person. And I think he must have felt safe with me because we had some really meaningful talks about struggles that we were having, that we had, that, yeah, the realities of life, the joys and the sorrows of life. So I'm thankful to have known Brian for 10 years and continuing relationship with his family. This last email that I received is from Mark Carlson. He says, Brian and I shared much in common. Maybe we were a bit destined to be friends. First, we met at Christ Church, Vienna, and whenever you meet a fellow foreign service officer, in a place away from the corridors of the State Department, there's a certain feeling of, you understand my life too, and I can understand yours. Brian knew what it was like to raise kids abroad, to adjust with family to new surroundings, to navigate change. When I first got to know Brian, he was already fighting his illness. Yet Brian always looked forward and had lots of ideas, hopes, and dreams of new places life might take him, Julia, and his kids. That energized him. He shared with me his great joy and pride in his career, and even in recent years, his work-related travel was exhilarating to him professionally, and a tremendous contribution to many embassies whose management functions were his deep expertise. For 2 years, we worked just a few floors apart. We were on de facto speed dial for spontaneous lunch breaks together. While we're close in age, Brian had a lot more years in the State Department than I, and I tapped his advice and perspective often during those lunch breaks. I can still feel and even hear his responses to my questions, and they were almost always met by a question back at me. Have you considered? What if this changed? ... Have you talked to someone about your question? Ha, that's a great counselor. Then he'd typically wrap it up with some nugget of wisdom or guidance, both as a friend but also as a colleague. I took his advice often, thankfully to my advantage. Brian, as we say goodbye, we know that your faith in Christ was also always a core value and source of strength while you walked alongside us here, and of faith you and I share. I know your life has not ended. It is just realized now in the fullness of God's presence. See you again, dear friend, Mark Carlson.
Thank you. Anyone else that would like to speak? Both come up. One will be next.
Hi, I'm Harvey Johnson, and I'm along with my friend here, and our friends over here were part of the Thursday night group. So we claim that segment of Brian. Now, if Brian were here, I think two things. He'd enjoy this, of course, because he knows everybody here. But he also knows that each one of us knew a snippet of Brian. And as we listen to everybody else speak, we're connecting dots that we didn't connect before. Brian would find that sort of whimsical. And that smile that Brian had, if he were sitting on the side, that's when he'd get that smile. He'd appreciate everybody here, but he would see us making these connections. And that's the way that Brian, I think, sort of thought about how we all to find different ways to connect. In our Thursday night group, we did a lot of different things together. And so we went through books, and sometimes if we started a book, it could take us years to get through a book. Brian wasn't the most patient person. And so for us to go years into one particular book really drew on Brian's patience a little bit. But we also ate together, and we ate thanks to our good friends who hosted us almost every Thursday night in their home. But Brian knew all of these sort of hole-in-the-wall restaurants. And we'd say, well, who wants to make a recommendation? Brian would, and of course, we would never recognize the name he gave us. But when we finally went there, it was always just a phenomenal place to eat. Even the night we all got together at his restaurant, everyone showed up except for Brian. So even though he wasn't there, he knew that we would enjoy that particular meal. And then I think there's a Peruvian chicken someplace close by, and twice we'd meet and he'd bring this chicken, which of course, talk about savor. When you got that particular chicken, I think it was a Peruvian chicken place that there's maybe one or two of them, but he would do that. You know, Brian wasn't exactly a joke teller, and he wasn't a great laugher. But one of the things we did is we watched movies together in Lee's basement, and every once in a while we'd actually get almost a chuckle from Brian about a particular movie, and that little almost chuckle was probably a high point that said, "Hey, this is like a 4-star movie." It actually generated that humor from Brian. And then, of course, there was one particular chair in that room that was the most comfortable, and that's always the night that Brian had a little bit of back problem. He just wanted that comfortable chair. Now, we believe there's probably a little bit of back to it, but he always got that special chair. And I think the thing I remember about Brian the most is, like, everyone talks about how he's the wise one and the counselor. And when you have very significant jobs, you get into this persona of being the wise one and the counselor. Hey, there were more than one night where Brian in our group was the one who needed the wisdom and the counsel. You know, Julie talked about Brian suffering from depression. And at one point, you know, in our group, Brian was really near the bottom in depression. And so the wise counselor to others could also be so vulnerable to his friends that we all knew exactly where Brian was. And if anything brought us closer together as a group, it's when we were also in that low point in our stories of life that Brian was always the one who wouldn't always lord over a thought of wisdom, but he'd make that connection and reach out and make a touch, and you knew that you had something special from Brian. But he was that guy that the very last speaker, they would inevitably say something that sort of pulled everything together, and so he filled that role quite a bit. He was well-read, and I think that came out in helping us sometimes. C.S. Lewis, anybody here, raise your hand if you understand C.S. Lewis very well. All right, if you raise your hand, then you're a liar. Nobody understands C.S. Lewis except Brian would, because he read all those books. He knew them better than we did. And when we were sitting here not quite sure what C.S. was saying this time, somehow he'd go back to some other book and bring something forward that I don't know that we ever claimed we understood it, but at least we could feel better about what we were reading. And I think in 8 years, all of us grow in life, and Brian grew as well, and so did Brian's family. And we grew up by hearing stories about Grace and about Peter, and knowing just how proud of both that he really was. And really more recently, and all of the things that they've done to have him tell us stories about it. You can just see almost, Julie talked about going from childhood to adolescence, and they never saw him as an adult to a father that many of us, I hope many of us enjoy. And you could see that transition point along the way, and Brian's pride in the way those transitions were going. And so again, for 8 years, that's a long time, almost every Thursday night. But whether we were in a Bible study or reading a whimsical book or a theological book or watching a movie or going out to eat, we also had activities. And so Lee had a boat. We went out on a boat one time and talked about extreme sports. So we didn't expect to actually get in the water in the boat. We were going to go on the boat. But of course, in this boat, it had this humongous inner tube. So who do you think got out in his shorts and took a ride around the bay on this inner tube? But our person who doesn't like extreme sports, Brian, partook of Chesapeake Bay. And who else would do that except Brian? And I think he was brave. It wasn't by accident that he had Basil drive him in his Mustang, because when we were in this boat, Basil drove the boat, the only one to push the throttle full forward. When Brian asked Basil to drive his Mustang, Brian knew that Basil was going to drive fast. Now, Basil said he drove fast just once or twice. My guess is that once they left, there was just floorboard, pedal to the floorboard, and it was wind blowing on Brian's hair both ways the whole trip. But I think he knew that Basil would do that, and I think he knew that that would be enjoyment for him. He was proud of that car, and it was just another example of the way Brian lived right on the edge a little bit and just fully enjoyed life. So again, I thank you all for speaking, and I thank you for giving us, in addition to Julia and Peter and Grace, insights into Brian. I think we'll all walk away out here and seeing another little slice of Brian that we didn't know about before, but somehow that connects the pieces that we know and gives us a richer picture of Brian. So again, I've appreciated this as well. It was a great idea to have people speak about Brian.
Wow. Great job, Harvey. So my name is Jeff Oakes, and I'm one of Brian's Thursday night brothers too. And God, I love these guys. And Brian, I just loved him from day one. And the thing that I saw in Brian that I found most attractive was that he was very self-aware, and he knew who he was. And he didn't wear masks and try to be somebody that he wasn't. He was very, very self-aware and was very comfortable in his own shoes. Is that the statement? And he was very real, and I admired that, and that was attractive, very attractive, that he just was so self-aware and so real, and I felt really comfortable having conversations with Brian and telling Brian anything and everything. And Brian, I mean, he already did a lot of social work on this earth. He is a very good listener and not judgmental, and very encouraging. And, you know, quite often you hear the question from Brian, and how did that make you feel? He's, you know, very, very probing, and he's a very good listener. He's probably my only friend in Northern Virginia who could tell you the name of my little hometown in Pennsylvania. And he just kind of threw that out at me one day, and I was shocked. My jaw almost hit the floor when I heard that from him. So like all my brothers, I've learned a lot from all of them, all of you, and Brian. And I'll tell you one thing I did learn from Brian too is that it's okay to be a little bit vulnerable in asking for things. When Brian was in the NIH study a few years ago, you know, he put the word out that, you know, I go out here one day a week or one day every 2 weeks, and it's quite a few hour thing, and I'd really welcome some company if anybody would be interested in joining me out here. And again, I was pretty taken aback because it's like, wow, I wouldn't have the courage to do that. But Brian was vulnerable, and he asked. And I think he got takers. And I just admire that vulnerability about him. And, you know, men, I hear, even though I am one, have a hard time being vulnerable. Women are a little better at it, I hear. But Brian was good at it. He was just very real. And that's part of being real and honest and knowing who you are, is just being comfortable asking people for help or for companionship or whatever. Okay, just one last little anecdote. Transitioning from COVID times to non-COVID times, I don't know, this spring, Friday evening, there's a big storm brewing. I make arrangements with Brian to go over and meet with him. And the drill was you pulled up, you got out of the car, and you went to the porch, and you met Brian on the porch. And there's this magnificent storm brewing out there. And I thought, oh, this is going to be spectacular. And I'm into the spectacular. I love weather. And I sat there for 15 minutes and just ate it up. I texted Brian, I called Brian, I thought, something's up, right now it's not a great time, so I'm just gonna sit here. And it was a great storm. And Julia came to the back door finally and opened the door and said, are you comfortable coming in? Brian had fallen asleep. He didn't see the text, he didn't get the phone call, but so that was kind of a COVID transition at the Wilson house, moving from the porch to the inside. Julia said, are you comfortable coming in? I said, of course. I'm vaccinated. It's been weeks, whatever. But that was one heck of a storm. Brian would have loved it too, had he been out there, but I think he was taking a little snooze. Love that guy to death. Just, he knew who he was, and he knew who he was. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? One of my old bosses said the reason he hires somebody is because they're self-aware. He said that's the most important thing he looks for when he hires somebody. So interesting. Lisa, my wife.
I wasn't sure. I certainly don't want to be the last one to speak, but I want to speak particularly to Grace and to Peter. And you have heard all these wonderful words about your father, which is your legacy that you can take forward. His wisdom. He's respected by every man here, which Peter, as you know, is one of the most important things a man can feel is respect, and from his friends particularly. My daughter noted before she left that she remembers watching your father love you and how he reveled in being a father, and that was wonderful. The reason I'm up here is because when I was 24 years old, I lost my father to the exact same disease that you lost your father to. And I didn't have that opportunity to know him as an adult, as your mother spoke to. But God takes care of us. He provides these wonderful friends to surround us with. Your father will give you signs as you go forward, whether it's on your wedding day and he happens to appear in a picture that you see months later, or if he speaks to you in a dream. That sounds a little weird, I know. But you will have little whispers from him as you go forward. And you have this wonderful family of friends who will walk with you and your mother. And he wants to be here. He wanted to be with you. He didn't want to leave you. And he left, however, a wonderful family, and that you can just grow into the adults that he dreamed that you would be. I also remember I love Brian intellectually as well. We love books. We love competing with trivia. And I even remember our last interaction, we were on Zoom, and I did something that didn't quite follow the rules of that trivia game, and he called me out. He loved to play games. He loved to compete. But I remember we were talking about a book, and as many have spoken to, this point is he would read a book, he would remember the book, and then he would apply the book. And it was The Boys in the Boat, which many of you I know have read. And I remember he said, after reading that book, I understood my father, because it's written about Washington State and, you know, just the grit and everything those boys went through to win those medals. And I just saw Brian in a whole new light, and that happened to me so often when I would spend time with him. I'd either learn he was a drama teacher or, you know, an English teacher, whatever it was. Every time I met him, I learned something new about him. But he had this incredible ability of taking the written word, applying it, sharing it, and finding a depth in it that I think is very rare. And that's something you two can also do as you go forward. So as I said, I don't want to be the last speaker. Please, someone follow me. And this is you.
Here you go.
Hi, my name is Deborah Torres, and my husband Jed is in the back, and our son is somewhere in there. Brian will always have a very special place in my heart because he helped bring our son here from the Philippines. We had been in the process, we were in home group together at their house from about 2004 to, I don't know, 2007, something like that, okay. And it was the last push of months before we could get our son, and the paperwork seemed to be stalled. We didn't know, we hadn't heard anything from the Philippines, and I tried a few things, and then I was coached to contact my congressman and see if I knew somebody at the State Department to contact the Philippines. So I did both of those things, and I plucked up the courage, and it was an easy ask. He made it very easy. I just said, Brian, could you help? I don't know to this day what exactly he did. I don't know if he called or he wrote a letter. I don't know if he pulled some strings. I don't know if he cashed in on some favors. I don't know what it cost him, but if he was here, he'd say it was no big deal. But it was a big deal to us because we didn't know what the heck had happened. Weeks later, we got a call saying that they had switched offices and all these files of adoption paperwork had been left in an old office. So I'd like to think Brian, how he helped, not only got our son here from the Philippines to the U.S., but got some other parents, their children too. The other thing I wanted to mention is I was very grateful when Peter spoke upstairs and reminded us how much Brian loved to live life. In home group, I remember being so astonished when I found out he was a cancer survivor. And I remember talking to him just one-on-one, and I was astonished because he, you couldn't tell by looking at him. Like, you couldn't tell. I mean, there was no baggage he was carrying. There was no woe is me surrounding him. And as I asked him with my astonishment about that, his response was that he was just going to go on and live his life. And in that, he spoke about how much he loved his wife enormously. To this day, I remember the look on his face toward Julia and the depth of love that I had not seen in just, shoulder to shoulder when you meet people. He glowed sometimes when he looked at Julia and his son and his daughter Grace, who were little when we were there. And I think that when he said in the car that someone spoke, that he said 6 times, "I don't want to die," I don't think he was unwilling to meet Jesus. I think he really wanted to say, "I don't want to leave my family. I don't want to leave Julia, Peter, and Grace." I think that's what he really meant, because that's what was clear to me.
Thank you. Anyone else that would like to speak? Great to hear that story of the adoption. That's a great story. Last call. Last call. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you for your support of the Wilsons. Peter, a really good word tonight. I was really touched by that. But just want to thank you so much for the time here. So good night, everyone.